All right, let's get to it. With Amanda LaFratta, I'm Dave Hooker. Let's get to it. And we're going to take a look at the SEC Power Poll that was put out by Saturday Down South. Where should Tennessee rank in terms of the Power Poll? We got message board bingo this day in sports history as well. Please hit that like and subscribe button. So the Power Poll was out by our friends at Saturday Down South. And Amanda, there were a couple of things, as you might imagine, that I would disagree with. So we'll go ahead and dive into those right now. As far as their thoughts, Georgia is number one in the SEC. I can't argue against that. I would have said that Alabama was number one to begin the year, but based off what I've seen, and I do believe in volatile polls. So if Texas A&M loses to Appy State like they did last week, in my mind they would drop about 6 spots. Now when we get to late October, there's more of a sample size, but right now I'd have Georgia at number one in the power poll over Alabama. You?
Again, because these polls really make no sense and way too early to call, I could see why people would put Georgia over Alabama. I'm, you know, not at all surprised and not unhappy about that decision. I would rather, have my team be number two and everything than to be number one because one, you're just a sitting duck. Like you're just waiting for somebody to come along and tear you down, and everyone's rooting for someone to come along and tear you down. However, with the opponents that Georgia played, it you know, Oregon with Bo Nix, and then you have, I don't even know, Samford, and they beat them by what, 33? I just don't. These power poll things are way too early to call on these. Like, it's just they're just way too early. We played 2 games.
Well, I think that Georgia or Alabama are certainly going to be one or two, and you can flip flop those, and we'll know a lot more. Of course, when they likely play each other in the SEC championship game. According to the Saturday Down South poll, Tennessee is in at number three. Now, this one's a little bit tough for me. And again, I think it's a coin flip. I would have Tennessee in at number three ahead of Kentucky and Arkansas because two reasons. One, I don't know how good Florida is that Kentucky beat. And with Arkansas, I'm not high, and I've said this from the get-go on South Carolina. So as far as that second tier, which I would call 3, 4, 5, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, who you got at the 3, 4, 5?
So I would honestly 1 through 5. I would just have everybody equal. I would have Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas. I feel like all of their wins are equally.
Well, wait. I mean,
But wait, what?
Tennessee and Kentucky and Arkansas aren't as good as Georgia and Alabama right now.
Well, not that you. I mean, you don't know that.
I feel pretty certain.
Well, that's fine, but you're also going after, like, you're going based on last year's performances too, not necessarily just this year.
No, I'll tell you what I'm going on, and it can be faulty, and I could be dead wrong. It's the eye test. I mean, when I watch those teams, the group of those top five teams, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Arkansas, I have no doubt that Georgia or Alabama are better than Tennessee top to bottom. Now Tennessee could pull an upset over either team in any given year. That can happen, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're better. I know that sounds goofy, but there are upsets, there are strange games that happen. That 98 Florida game that we just talked about was one. I mean, I'm not sure the best team won that day. So,
But Alabama and Texas, you could watch that game and tell me that the eye test tells you that they're better than Tennessee, Arkansas, or Kentucky, because I can't.
based off talent, yeah. I mean, I would look at that game and I would say, Byron Young's a good player. Will Anderson,
Bryce Young.
no, Byron Young at Tennessee is a good player, and Will Anderson, even though they absolutely completely schemed against him, is still an incredible player and far superior to Byron Young. I don't even think that's close. I don't care what the stats say on that particular Saturday. When I watch those players, I don't even think it's close. So, me, based off the eye test, I look at the two teams. I look at, if you want to talk about quarterbacks, I look at Bryce Young. I compare him to Hooker. I think Bryce Young is a better quarterback. I think Bryce Young saved them last week against Texas. And so, based off the eye test, no, I look at it as far as from a talent standpoint, and I think I can draw some conclusions. My conclusions may not be right 3 weeks from now. Maybe Will Anderson has been laying back on the couch eating Doritos all off season. I don't know, but I don't think that's the case, and I think that he is an incredible talent. Um, and when I look at the next tier, I would say that you're kind of along the lines of teams that are trying to get in those significant bowl games, and I don't know that they will. And that would be Mississippi State, Florida, Ole Miss, who you said would be a good fit in the Music City Bowl, Texas A&M, South Carolina, LSU. Now LSU's one that I've got in that third tier right now that I don't know, they could come together and be fine. Auburn, Missouri, Vanderbilt. So I guess the way I would break it down as far as the power rankings, I'm not going to take issue with where one team's ranked above the other or not, but I would say my tiers, based off what I've seen, the old eye test that can be faulty, are Georgia and Alabama. And so far, I've got Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas on that second tier. Then I've got State, Florida, Ole Miss, A&M on another tier. LSU is the toughest one of the group to me. They could be in the third tier or the bottom tier, depending on if they implode. But I think the bottom tier is clearly South Carolina. I don't like their roster, never did. Auburn, Missouri, and Vanderbilt. So that's just kind of how I would have it tiered out. But we get to argue from week to week about who's going to be higher or not.
Yeah, I mean, I have it in different tiers because
Lay it on me, sister.
Okay, so I have those top five in one tier based on eye test, based on watching them perform. And I know you said that Bryce Young is a better talent and Will Anderson's a better talent. However, the way that they performed as a team wasn't better. It wasn't better.
So
There were a lot of holes. There were a lot of problems going forward. There were a lot of penalties. So I don't see a solid reason to put Alabama or Georgia above everybody else, especially not that Kentucky win against Florida. That was very, very impressive. I don't care what you say, or not you, but anybody says that was a very impressive showing, especially in the swamp with Kentucky. The Arkansas over South Carolina. South Carolina's not great, but they're also not terrible. So that was impressive to me, especially since I did not give Arkansas a lot of consideration before the season started. And then you have the Tennessee over Pitt in a hostile environment, winning in one overtime. I just based on eye test, I put them all in the same category at the moment because again we're only 2 weeks in, and I think coming up to that fourth week we'll really be able to see a divide there. I'm going to go with just the bottom at the moment. We'll go with obviously Vandy. Vandy looks like Vandy. Missouri looks awful. Um, Texas A&M lost to App State, but the main issue, and it's the worst quarterback rating in the SEC from week 2, is their quarterback position. That's a huge problem at Texas A&M, and I don't see it getting any better anytime soon. LSU seems like a dumpster fire to me, just from the outside looking in, especially with all of the problems they're having regarding their players, personnel, stuff, just stuff outside of really the football field. That seems like a big problem to me. So I would put them in the bottom tier, and we'll just go ahead and throw Auburn in there as well, even though I'm not sure if they're in the middle or the bottom. I would say more towards the bottom. But then everybody else kind of falls in the middle there. Those are my tiers. I have three.
So you would have Alabama and Georgia. You would have any other team in that their tier.
I would have Alabama, Georgia, based on just this season, based on eye test, based on what they've done against opponents. I would have Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Arkansas in a top five tier, just based on what they've done.
Well, I mean, I hope you're right because that would be a really compelling year in the SEC. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think Alabama and Georgia are going to wax most of the teams they play, including those in the SEC. But again, the eye test can always be faulty. There's no question about that. But that's the way I see it now. It's kind of a two, and then another group, and really LSU, like I said earlier, and this is a team that Tennessee is going to play in Baton Rouge, is the biggest X factor. Could they get everything together and from a corporate culture standpoint and come out and play better? Sure, they could. Do I think that'll happen? Wow. When you've got a player that's saying you know,
I'm out.
a player that is already talking about transferring, I doubt it. I doubt
No, I mean that's a cultural standpoint, and that's going to be something a lot harder to adjust and a lot harder to change in a short amount of time than personnel, than who you're putting out there. The cultural aspect of what's happening at LSU is and Tennessee fans know this more than probably anybody, is a bigger factor than who you're putting on the field at one at any given time. You can have, like, for example, App State, you can have a team that plays as a team that has a common goal that meshes well on the field, outside of the field, that everything is cohesive. And then you can have a Texas A&M team with multiple 4 and 5 star talent just completely crumble. But the cultural aspect of what's going on, and I think that Texas A&M has a cultural problem. I think, as we've seen with the multiple videos just surfacing through on Twitter, I think that they have a big problem, and I think LSU has a big problem cultural wise.
Yep. No, I agree. I mean, and that probably if you're an LSU fan and you want to be realistic about it, you're hoping that gets fixed by next year. Much the same way when Nick Saban took over Alabama. I think they finished 7-6 that year, I believe. The very his
Lost to Louisiana Monroe.
Yeah, and they mentioned before they had to kick off their best defensive player, maybe best player all around at the beginning of the year because he was selling cocaine in the parking lot. So I think if you're, excuse me, a realistic LSU fan, that's what you're hoping for is not for players to sell cocaine in the parking lot, but for a kind of clean house and be respectable because Ed Orgeron ran that culture into the ground. So I think that's what you're hoping for is a culture change. You enter next year. The bad dudes, if you don't like them, whether that's Booty or whoever it is, they're gone. They transfer. Life changes, and you're respectable this year. Now you don't want to win 5 games, okay? Don't get me wrong, but
No.
really, it's the long play with Brian Kelly because the more I hear about what was happening under Ed Orgeron, the more I think that they have or had every bit as big of a mess. And that includes all the way up to the athletic director and president of the university position. They had every bit as big of a mess as they did last year.